Hey there, I'm Sarah A. Chrisman, the author of The Tales of Chetzemoka and other books about the Victorian era, and today I'm going to talk to you about spiritualism.
In a rapping at the door, Book 3 of the Tales of Chetzemoka, a phony spiritualist named Esmeralda comes to town with a bag of tricks under her long robe and some sneaky plans up her pre-Raphaelite sleeves. It's up to Nurse McCoy to expose Esmeralda for the con artist she is, and she does a bang-up job of it. The idea for the story was inspired by an actual case investigated by Alan Pinkerton in the 19th century, when claiming spiritualist superpowers was a common tactic of the sort of con artists who have preyed on the vulnerable since the dawn of time, and doubtless will continue to plague mankind as long as there are pigeons to be plucked. But why was this particular style of con artist so successful in the 19th century, and how did spiritualism get started? Therein hangs a tale. In the mid-19th century, people were becoming accustomed to technology turning unbelievable feats into everyday occurrences. Factories were turning out products at a rate that would have astonished previous generations. Trains were shrinking travel times to an ever-expanding network of places, and the steel plow was just starting to convert vast expanses of seemingly useless grassland into amber waves of grain. Life was getting better all the time, and yet the one thing people still couldn't get away from is that inevitably for each of us, sooner or later, life must end someday. And yet, with so many advances happening in the material world, it seemed only natural that an equal breakthrough in the spiritual world should be right around the corner. After all, if a telegram could now send messages hundreds of miles with the speed of lightning, was it really so outlandish to think that someone would come up with a way to communicate with departed souls who might still be very near and who were presumably watching over us? Enter now on this scene two very bored young girls with a spirit of mischief. In 1848, Maggie Fox and her little sister Katie decided to liven up some dull evenings in their bumpkin backwater of a town by playing a joke on their parents. It was taken far too seriously, and after it was too late, the girls realized that their childish prank set a chain of events in motion, which quickly ran out of control. Many years later, as a grown woman who felt tortured by her own creation, Maggie Fox revealed how innocently it had all started, and her confessions were published in a book titled The Death Blow to Spiritualism. Thanks to this book, as well as Maggie's many speaking appearances, her demonstrations and statements to reporters, we know how American spiritualism got started in 1848, because the founder herself admitted it was a hoax, and she showed how she'd done it. As bored young girls living in a dull, dreary town with too few books, the Fox sisters were starved for entertainment, so they played around and got creative. They tied apples to strings and bounced them on the floorboards of their bedroom to mimic footsteps, and when their mother came to investigate the noises, she would find the seemingly innocent young girls tucked in bed. The apples, of course, had been pulled out of sight. After Katie learned to snap her fingers, she, Maggie, and their niece Lizzie practiced doing the same thing with their toes. With nothing better to do, they spent a lot of time practicing, and as the saying goes, practice makes perfect. They were still young enough for their joints to be very pliable and trainable, and eventually they could create noises of different intensities by snapping, popping, or partially dislocating their toe joints at will. They called these noises knockings or rappings, and on March 31st they used their newly acquired skill with this silly human trick to make their mother think their house was haunted. Unfortunately, they were a little too convincing, and by the time Katie told their mother, "Tomorrow is April Fool's Day, and it's somebody trying to fool us," the incredibly superstitious Mrs. Fox had gotten so attached to the idea that she was hearing a ghost knocking that she refused to give up her conviction in it. When a neighbor was brought in to hear the sounds, the sisters realized they'd gone too far, and the only way to avoid getting into so much trouble they didn't even want to think about it was to keep up with the charade. Not everyone in the Fox family was as gullible as Maggie and Katie's mother, though. When their much older sister Leah heard about what was going on, she dragged her sisters into a private room and demanded to know how they were pulling off the trick. When they shamefacedly showed her, she didn't lecture them or send them out to the woodshed. She didn't even tell their parents that they'd been had. Leah had bigger ideas. She scented money in the wind. With Leah as their manager, the Fox sisters began a series of demonstrations and what would come to be called seances. First, through a series of simple and usually leading questions, answered by the toe-pop knockings, and later by using an alphabet board, also in conjunction with the knockings, the sisters convinced people that they could use a sort of spiritual telegraphy to speak to the dead. The idea spread like wildfire. Countless other mediums copied the girls' tricks in different ways and with their own variations, and some of them were very convincing indeed. At its peak, the American Spiritualist movement had over 1 million followers. In very much the same way that modern media organizations and personalities compete with each other in a virtual arms race of flamboyant hyperbole and exaggeration, spiritualist con artists of the 19th century developed increasingly elaborate illusions to support their claims of supernatural communication. Adopting the sleight of hand tricks long known to magicians was a natural fit that allowed a skilled artist to make writing from the spiritual world seem to suddenly appear on one slate within a stack, or helped a fraud answer a question that seemed to stay sealed unread inside an envelope the whole time. Some fraudulent spiritualists became quite adept at chemistry and would incorporate chemical reactions into their acts, such as using chemical potassium to make it look like pure water was bursting into flame, or phosphorus to create weird glowing lights. These hoaxsters kept up with the latest innovations in technology, and when glow-in-the-dark paint was developed, they made extensive use of it. In 1880, a trade journal called the American Architect and Building News ran a piece on the luminous paint which was being used to make life buoys, moorage buoys, and diving equipment glow in the dark. To sailors, the usefulness of a life preserver that glowed in the dark was obvious, but most landsmen wouldn't necessarily have heard of this innovation. Word sure spread among spiritualists, though. Fraudsters worked out that by cutting the paint with turpentine, they could thin it down enough to use on muslin and netting, as well as create glow-in-the-dark powder. The smell of turpentine was impossible to get rid of, but they disguised it with lots of patchouli oil. The patchouli didn't get rid of the smell, but it did make it harder to identify in a situation so far from the usual context of paint thinner. Most sitters at a séance would have just accepted it as part of the strange mystery of the whole thing. The most elaborate séances went far beyond the childish wrappings of the Fox sisters. By the 1890s, some fraudulent spiritualists were using a combination of psychological tricks, sleight of hand, props covered in phosphorescent paint, and partners in crime, usually also covered in glow-in-the-dark paint, to convince the sitters at séances that they were communicating with the dead, or with supernatural beings called spirit guides or spirit queens. The most successful of these hoaxsters bilked their victims out of thousands of dollars. Quite a hefty sum for a time when you could build a nice little house for a few hundred. Con artists and tricksters like the phony spiritualists who swindled people in the Victorian era are still around looking for easy marks. So remember, if you scent patchouli on the wind and someone shows up who offers to contact the spirit world for you, keep a firm hold on your wallet and a level head on your shoulders. The art of the swindle is as old as humanity itself.
Thank you for watching today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a nice thumbs up and remember to tell your friends about my books. Happy reading!